Today I'm going to tell you a very old French story that is called The White Cat. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was a king. He was a good and fine king, and he had 3 sons who grew up to be excellent young men. They were handsome, they were brave, they were kind to the people around them, excellent in every way. But the king was afraid that these 3 young men, if they were hanging around the palace too long, would start wanting to take over the kingdom from him, and he was not quite ready to give up being king yet. So he decided he needed to think of a way to keep them busy. So one day he called the 3 of them in to see him, and he told them that he was going to send them off into the world on an adventure. He said, "Before too long, it's going to be time for me to give over my kingdom to one of the 3 of you. And when I retire, I will go out into the countryside, and I would like to have a nice little dog to keep me company. So go off, travel, enjoy yourselves. And the one who brings me the most beautiful little dog will be the next king, regardless of your ages." Well, the 3 sons were rather surprised at their father's sudden desire for a nice dog, but they were young and adventurous. They were happy enough to go off and travel the world and explore. And the younger 2 were pleased to have a chance at winning the throne, and the eldest, well, he was either too polite or too timid to complain. The 3 of them had their final meal together with all their best friends. And the following morning, before each of them set off on their own way, the 3 of them agreed that they would never let foolish jealousy come between them, and that whichever of them was fortunate enough to win the kingdom would make sure that his brothers were well cared for, so that they could always be friends. And they agreed that they would meet at that same palace the night before they were due to go back to their father, and then they would all go back with their little dogs together. And off they went, and no doubt the elder 2 had fine adventures, but this story is about the youngest son, who had grand adventures and found many beautiful dogs, and as he travelled alone, he quickly found that he could not keep too many of them all at the same time, so each time he found a dog that he thought was nicer than the last one, well, he would give away or sell the dog he already had and buy the new one. And so he went around until one day he was passing through a forest in a part of the world he'd never been in before and didn't know, when suddenly a storm blew up, and it began raining, and it got dark, and he couldn't see his way, and he lost the path, and he was stumbling through the trees when he was very grateful to see a little glowing light in the distance. And he followed the light, which led him out into the clearing, where he found a magnificent castle. He was very surprised. He had never seen such a magnificent thing before, and when he walked up to the gates, he was very surprised to see the gates were covered in gold and studded with jewels. It was the light of the jewels that had drawn him there. He pulled the bell pull, and the doors opened, but when he looked inside, the only thing he could see were hands holding torches. No bodies, no people, just hands floating in the air, and it looked very strange and eerie, and he took a step backwards, not at all sure he wanted to go in there. But a couple of the hands slipped around behind him and gently pushed him, so he had no choice but to walk inside. And truly he was glad to get out of the pouring rain. And he heard the doors close behind him, and his hand went to his sword, not at all sure what to expect next. And then he heard a very kind, gentle voice calling out, "Welcome, Prince! No danger fear. Laughter and love await you here. you may chance to break the spell that on a lovely lady fell. Welcome, Prince, no danger fear. Laughter and love await you here. Well, that made him feel much better. I mean, surely with such a kind, gentle welcome, nobody was planning to chop his head off or something. So he followed the hands down the hall, past rooms of great magnificence. The hallway itself was paved with blue lapis lazuli. The walls were covered with mother of pearl, which glowed softly in the light of the lamps. Each room seemed more magnificent than the one he'd seen before, until finally the hands led him into a rather small, cosy room with a fire burning brightly. There was a screen in the middle of the room, and behind the screen the hands led him to a bath. The prince was cold and dirty, covered in mud. He was very grateful to see a tub filled with hot, fragrant water. Delighted, he took off his wet, muddy clothes and he washed himself in the warm water from head to toe until he felt much better. And when he got out of the bath, he discovered that a fine suit of dry, fresh clothes had been laid out for him. And so when he emerged from behind the screen, it was a very different young prince from the bedraggled, wet, miserable one who had arrived at the palace door a little while earlier. He was led into a dining room where there was a lovely table, and at the end of the table 2 places were laid with golden plates and knives and forks and beautiful crystal, and he was led to a chair where he sat down. And a moment later another door opened and in ran a company of cats, each cat holding a musical instrument. All stringed instrument, guitars and lutes and things, and they ran up onto the stage, they settled themselves down comfortably, and they began to draw their claws over the strings of the instruments, making the most strange music. And then they began to sing. Meow, 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 they sang, and the prince burst out laughing. He thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen. Before much more time passed, the door opened again, and in came a whole group of cats. They were led by a tiny little figure completely covered by a black veil, wearing a dress with a train that reached out behind her, and the train was carried by more cats, and the little figure made its way right up to where the prince sat. And then she threw back the veil, and the prince saw the most beautiful little white cat that he had ever seen. And she bowed and she said, "King's son, you are welcome here. The Queen of the Cats is pleased to greet you." The prince jumped to his feet and he bowed in turn, and he said, "Madam Cat, I am very grateful to you for your hospitality. Thank you for the warmth with which you have welcomed me. But tell me, please, surely you are no ordinary cat. The way you speak to me tells me that to begin with, and what a magnificent castle you have here." "Oh, please, no compliments. I am not used to compliments like that," said the Queen of the Cats. "Please, sit down and eat." The meals that were served to them, the prince's, looked like chicken, but what was put on the plate of the Queen of the Cats were 3 or 4 plump mice with their tails still attached. And the prince drew back, not sure he wanted to eat his own food after all. "Oh, don't worry, Prince," said the Queen of the Cats. "We know what people like. Your food will have no part of any mouse or rat in it. Don't worry. You can eat without fear." And then she called out to the musicians, "Stop playing now. The prince can't understand our music." They ate together, and the prince found that the white cat was an excellent companion. She chatted about this and that. They were interested in many of the same things. But he did notice she sighed, and she looked very sad. And then, when they had finished eating, the prince noticed that on the little paw next to him, the princess, the Queen of the Cats, wore a bracelet with a portrait in the middle of it, and he asked if he might see it. With another sigh, she held out her paw so that he could look at it, and the prince was amazed because the portrait was of a young man who looked so much like himself that it might have been his own picture. But when he turned to the cat to ask her about it, he saw a tear trickling down her face. So he left it be. He didn't want to distress her any further. After they had eaten, the hands led the prince to a bedchamber where he spent a wonderful night. The next day he arose to find the whole company of cats ready to go hunting. As soon as he was able to join them, he went out into the courtyard where they were all gathered, and the hands led him over to a wooden horse. He was rather indignant, and he said, "I'm not a child to ride on a wooden horse." But they paid no attention. They just lifted him up and plopped him on the back of the horse, which immediately started to prance and dance around the palace courtyard. And the whole company went off on their hunt, and a grand time was had by them all. They had a fine dinner that evening, and after dinner, the Queen of the Cats had ordered a play to be acted out of Puss in Boots by all the cats. And every day following was as beautiful and as much fun as the first. And the prince fell in love with the white cat and the castle, and he was having such a good time that he forgot all about his father and his brothers and the dog and getting back there on time. But the Queen of the Cats didn't forget, and one day she said to him, "You know, my prince, your two brothers are getting ready to travel home, and each of them has found a very beautiful dog to present to your father. They will be doing that in 3 days' time." "What? Oh no, how could I have been so foolish?" said the prince. "I forgot all about it, and this is the most important thing I have to do. My whole future depends on it. Even supposing I could find a beautiful dog in 3 days, how would I ever get back there? I travelled weeks to get here." "Don't worry, Prince," said the white cat. "You are my friend, and I will help you. The good wooden horse will get you back home so quickly you can still spend another day here. And as for the dog, well, I have one here for you, which is more beautiful than the one in the dog star itself." And she held out an acorn. The prince looked a little dubious and said, "Surely your majesty is teasing me." She held the acorn next to the prince's ear, and inside he could hear a tiny little voice going, "Yip, yip, yip." He knew it was true. He wanted to open the acorn and look at the dog at once, but the Queen of the Cats said, "No, you must leave it exactly so until you're standing in front of your father. The little dog might catch cold if you open it too soon." So they had a nice evening together again, and the next morning it was time for the prince to go back to his father. He was so sad to leave the castle and the white cat, and he said, "Won't you please come with me?" He called the little white cat Blanchette. That's French for little white one. "Blanchette, won't you please come with me? I will miss you so much. I've grown to love you over this year." "Oh no, I'm just a little cat. I have no place in the world," she said. "I will stay here, but you go, and I hope the little dog will win you your kingdom." So sadly the prince said goodbye, and the wooden horse got him home so quickly that he was the first of the three to arrive. He left the wooden horse in the courtyard and he went inside to make himself comfortable, and as soon as he heard his brothers arriving, he rushed out to say hello to them. The three brothers were delighted to be back together again. They were so pleased they hadn't seen each other for a whole year. The elder two brothers all showed their dogs, which were beautiful little dogs, sitting in fancy little baskets on velvet cushions. The youngest didn't show what he had brought. He managed to suggest that a rather common-looking dog that happened to be around the courtyard was the dog he had brought. And as his brothers launched into all the tales of all the adventures he'd had there, the youngest brother listened and laughed and enjoyed the conversation. But nobody noticed that he didn't say anything about what he had been doing. Next morning, the three of them got up and they dressed in their most beautiful clothes and they went to see their father. By the time they arrived at the palace, the ordinary dog, which had just followed along in the dust, was covered in dust and mud, and he didn't even go into the palace with them. The two eldest brothers couldn't help feeling just a little bit pleased. They loved one another, but still, clearly the youngest brother's dog wasn't going to be competition for their two beautiful little dogs at all. They presented their dogs to the king. The king was delighted to see his sons again and very pleased. Each dog was beautiful, so beautiful that no one could decide which of the two was the better. And the two elder brothers were starting to look at each other and think about maybe what they should do is divide the kingdom between the two of them, when the youngest stepped forward and said, "But father, I haven't given you my dog yet." And he took the acorn out of his pocket and held it out. Everyone giggled. Who had ever heard of a dog in an acorn? But the youngest prince just put it on his hand and he lifted the top off very gently, and sure enough, there, on a little cushion inside the base of the acorn cup, sat the prettiest, daintiest little dog imaginable. The prince took it and he set it on his father's hand, and at once the little dog started jumping about, doing a little jig, yipping and hopping in the most beautiful, cheerful way possible, and everyone knew this must be the most beautiful, dainty, tiny little dog imaginable. This was surely the most special dog in all the world. The youngest son felt he had certainly won the kingdom. But the king was not ready to give it up yet, and he said, "My sons, I am so pleased to find that you have been willing to work so hard to give me something beautiful. I am so pleased, in fact, that I'm going to ask you to do it again. Go out into the world again. Enjoy yourselves, have adventures, explore the world. And at the end of the year, bring me a piece of fabric, a piece of cloth, so fine and thin and delicate that it will pass through the eye of a needle." Well, the older two sons were glad to have another chance at the kingdom, and the youngest son was eager to go back to his white cat and see her again, and he thought she would probably help him again. And so he didn't complain either. The three princes had dinner together once more, and then the following day they set off on their own separate journeys once more. The youngest prince galloped off on his wooden horse straight back to the white cat, where he spent another year as lovely as the first. Now and then he would look at the white cat and he would ask her questions, which she always just brushed aside. He would ask, "Are you under a spell? Did somebody enchant you to be a cat? You are surely no ordinary cat. You are so clever and so much fun." But she just pushed his questions aside. Sometimes he might ask, "Are you a fairy? Can you change your shape?" "Oh, don't ask me questions, Prince. I can't answer them anyway," said the white cat. "Just let's enjoy ourselves, and never mind about that." And so they did. And when the end of the second year came, the white cat told him, "I am ready for you. I have prepared an escort for you this year, and perhaps when you arrive in great splendor, your father will be ready to give you the crown that you deserve." When he looked out of the window, the prince saw a beautiful golden carriage decorated with flame-colored porcelain panels. It was pulled by 12 white horses, and behind the carriage rode a company of soldiers, all dressed in magnificent uniforms. "And here is the cloth you asked me for," said the white cat, and she handed the prince a walnut. "Blanchette, I don't want to leave you," said the prince. "Just say the word and I will stay here. I will just stay here and be with you forever." "No, no, don't. That would not be right at all. You must go back to your family, go back to your father and your brothers, and let us see if this time your father will give you the kingdom you deserve." So sadly the prince said goodbye to his white cat. He got into the carriage and galloped off. This time he was not early enough to meet his brothers before they went to the palace. He arrived at the palace at about the same time as them, and everyone was very impressed at the richness with which he arrived and the beautiful carriage and so on. And the three of them went in to the king. The king was delighted to see his sons again, and the elder two sons presented their fabric, which was beautiful and fine, and it would pass through the eye of a rather large darning needle. But the king had brought his own special needle, and it was clear at a glance that the fabric would not pass through the eye of that needle. "What about my youngest son?" said the king. "Mine is here," he said, and he took out a walnut. People had seen a dog come out of the acorn a year before, so they didn't say much. He opened the walnut, and inside the walnut was a hazelnut, a smaller nut. He opened the hazelnut, and inside the hazelnut was a cherry pit. He opened the cherry pit, and inside the cherry pit was its own kernel. Everyone was beginning to titter and laugh at this point. He opened the kernel of the cherry, and inside was a grain of wheat. He opened the grain of wheat, and inside that was a millet seed. Millet seed is a tiny, tiny seed, like bird seed. Even the prince started to wonder at this point. "White cat," he thought to himself, "are you tricking me?" And he felt a sharp scratch on his hand, and hoping that was meant to be encouragement, he opened the millet seed, and out of the tiny millet seed flowed a long, beautiful piece of fabric, so fine it easily passed through the eye of the king's needle. It was woven with all the colors of the rainbow in soft patterns shifting in shapes across the length of the fabric. It was magnificent. Clearly, the youngest son had won the contest for the second time. But the king was still not ready to give up his throne. "My sons, I am delighted you have done very well with your gift for me. Now, whichever of you is going to be king after me must be married. Being king is no job to do without a queen at your side. Go off, travel, enjoy yourselves for one more year. This will be the last one, I promise you. The one who brings back the most beautiful princess to marry, to be his bride, will be the next king, I promise." Well, the youngest prince went back to his white cat, and he told her, "I need a princess now." She said, "Did your father still not give you the throne?" He is still not ready, and to tell you the truth, my white cat, he is so loath to give up his throne it would be no pleasure to take it from him." So another year passed as happily as the first two had. When the day arrived finally, when it was time for the prince to go back to his father, the white cat sat him down next to her, and she said, "My prince, do you trust me?" "Trust you? I would trust you with my life. I have fallen in love with you long ago, Blanchette." "If I ask you to do something for me, will you promise me that you will do it?" "Of course, I would do anything you ask me to. I promise." "Good." She stood up, and she made him stand up too, and she said, "Now, the thing you have to do for me is to take your sword and chop off my head and my tail and throw them into the fire." "What? No! Blanchette, I love you. I could never cut off your head," said the prince. "Ask me anything you want. But don't ask me to kill you. I could never do such a thing." "My prince, you promised me, and you're a man of your word. This is what you must do for me. Chop off my head, chop off my tail, and throw them into the fire." Well, the prince begged and pleaded and tried to get out of it, but in the end he had no choice. With a trembling hand he drew his sword, and as quickly as he could, so that it would be as with as little pain as possible, he slashed off the queen's head and her tail, and he threw them into the fire. And no sooner was that done than in there before him stood the most beautiful princess in the world. And she said, "Thank you, king's son. You have saved me. You have been right all through these years when you've asked me, was I under an enchantment? Yes, I was. A wicked fairy had a quarrel with my parents, and they turned me into a cat. And they told me that the only way I would be able to break the enchantment, at the time they turned me into a cat, I was betrothed to marry a young prince. They told me the only way the spell would be broken was if I could find another young prince who looked exactly like my fiancé, and if he would agree to do what you have just done. You've saved me." The doors opened, and all the other people came running in with catskins over their arms. Everyone had been released from the spell. "Now," Blanchette said, "it's time for us to go back to your father. I have prepared everything for our journey." They went out, and there was the carriage again, and in the carriage, next to the seat the prince would sit on, was a great big beautiful crystal, just the right size for the princess to sit inside it, so that when they arrived at the king's palace, no one would know she was in there. She was a princess who liked games, I think. And sure enough, when they arrived at the palace, the king came out to greet them. The elder two brothers were already there with their beautiful young princesses to be their brides. And the king came to the carriage and said, "My youngest son, what have you brought for me this time?" "Ah, father," said the prince, "I fell in love with the prettiest white cat in the world." And he held his hand out to the crystal. His father touched the top of the crystal, and the whole thing shattered, exposing the beautiful princess. She got out of the carriage, and she bowed, and she said, "Your Majesty, I have fallen in love with your son, and with your consent, I would like to marry him. But you do not have to give up your kingdom. I have 3 kingdoms of my own. Your youngest son can come and help me to rule my kingdom, and I will give one to each of your older sons. You continue to rule your kingdom until the day comes when you are truly tired and ready to hand it over. And then your youngest son and I will rule in your place, but not before. Well, a fine triple wedding was held. The 3 princes married their 3 beautiful princesses. They each had their own kingdom to rule, and the old king ruled on his own until he was really ready to hand it over. And that's the story of the White Cat.